Greetings. My name is Stephan Haggard, and I'm here with Munsub Lee. We work together on the Korea Pacific program at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UCSD. We're just letting people into the Zoom room now, so we'll just give a few seconds for everyone to get situated, and then we'll start our discussion with Chad O'Carroll of NK News. Just give us about 15 seconds. Great. Well, it looks like we've got a group joining us. And Chad, you should know that we put these up on our website, and usually they get a reasonable number of visits from our students who can't join us when it's going live. But I'm here today with Chad O'Carroll, and Chad really occupies a very unique position within the whole ecosystem of North Korean news. If I recall, Chad, going back to 2010, I think is when I first established contact with you, when you founded NK Pro and NK News. And in my opinion, and my humble opinion, but correct opinion, NK News and NK Pro are now just by far the most important news site for analysis, commentary, but also data on North Korea. And there's some quite extraordinary parts of the site, which I think I'll get you to talk about. So I thought what we would do today is divide this conversation into three parts. First, instead of introducing Chad, I'm just going to talk with Chad and get him to talk a little bit first about how NK Pro and NK News came into existence and some of the features of the site. And then Chad will share a few slides about the whole news ecosystem around North Korea, because there are a variety of additional things he might want to say about that. And then, time permitting, we'll also talk a little bit about the substance, because, of course, there's always lots to talk about in North Korea, from drones and balloons to the Russians. But Chad, why don't you just start by telling us, how did you get this thing going, and what motivated you to start it?
Yeah, so can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're great.
Yep. So it all started during my master's thesis in King's College London. I was doing nuclear non-proliferation and international security. And of course, North Korea was a case study. And I was doing what the school asked me not to, and working full-time and doing a full-time master's, and balancing both, which gave me a bit more economic security than other students. And I thought I would invest some of that in going to North Korea in the summer of 2009 to just see what the country's like. I'd watched a lot of documentaries. I was starting to go down the rabbit hole. Basically went there, and it really just sucked me in. It was like literally stepping into a time machine. I came out, I wanted to read a lot. That's when I started reading all the blogs like NK Econ Watch, and 38 North was starting around then. And basically, I decided to go back 2 subsequent years, and those latter 2 years coincided with an internship in DC, beginning to meet South Korean journalists who were aware of my travels to North Korea. And it dawned on me that these journalists were beginning to write stories about some of the photos I was taking in North Korea. For example, I spotted American like filters in a swimming pool at Kim Il-sung University, and they just had all the like Made in Oregon logos. And I was like, wow, that's really weird that there's that paradox juxtaposition there. And I guess seeing the journalists take interest in this, and being so invested in reading about North Korea, I started a very primitive website, which was really like a pre-Substack newsletter aggregator of everything that was out there in English, including your blog with Marcus Noland. That was a regular. And I also started posting kind of like blog entries about what foreigners were spotting in North Korea. Probably back then there would be maybe 2,000-3,000 foreigners, like aid workers, diplomats, etc. And they were really an untapped source, I guess, of information, primary source information, which was much needed in the field. And so the website started like that. Very long story short, I was then hired by a major Korea-focused think tank in DC that all went great. They gave me some space to cultivate the website alongside my duties. And then after my boss was changed, the new boss came in and fired me in April 2013, which was a real double-edged sword. On the one hand, I was sad to be leaving DC, but on the other, it was like being pushed out of the balloon, the hot air balloon, and you're sort of on your own. And if you want the soft landing, you have to work hard, right? So that really motivated me to just go all out the website rather than do it as a side hustle. And that I'm not going to lie, it was hard. I had to go and live with my parents again, aged like 30, and then work very hard, build it all with kind of sweat capital, a tiny amount of investment. And fast forward to today, and we're now in a position where the website is going very well. And basically, yeah, we're serving news, information, data to people from embassies, think tanks, research organizations, corporate sector, banks, NGOs, the sort of full range, basically.
And academics, I should add,
And
because obviously it's a major source. I mean, a number of us who watch North Korea have written for the site, but more importantly, we read it.
Yeah.
I want you to, you're going to maybe put up some slides here in a minute on the whole North Korean news ecosystem, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. First, to our students, as this is an example of someone who has a master's degree and became an entrepreneur in this issue. But I'd like you to just talk about a couple of parts of the site in particular, so we can kind of introduce them. When did you get the idea for all of these trackers? Because those seem to be, really data exercises that are quite interesting.
Yeah.
A lot of work.
Yeah, so basically when I was at the think tank in DC, we were lucky enough to have an intern called Luke Herman who was working with us.
He's a former student of ours.
Right. I think that's perfect. And Luke was doing this really interesting initiative to do scanning of North Korean state media articles and build a leadership tracker. So he was going through the entire corpus of Korea Central News Agency, searching for mentions of dear leader Kim Jong-il, and then creating a data set and manually categorizing each leadership appearance, judging by the ranking of the secondary and tertiary officials with him, turning that into a data value. And through that, I witnessed, data is not my area of expertise, but I witnessed the creation of data, meaningful data from effectively plain text reporting from a state media propaganda outfit, right? So we were kind of reverse engineering data from their output. And luckily, North Korea is very consistent in how they approach framing things with the leadership. So that the order of mentions of officials is really important and consistent usually. So that was kind of where, I mean, he did a great job. We turned it into an interactive visualization together. And then we sort of took that logic and applied it to other areas like maritime, ship tracking data, aviation. We started building currency trackers using some of the sources we were cultivating in Pyongyang. And yeah, I think overall, and we built a company database. Yeah, all like the North Koreans publish these quarterly things called foreign trade, which detail all of the products that they're building domestically for the outside market. And we just went through the whole library and threw all that together. So yeah, it kind of worked.
There's a lot of interest right now in the exchange rate because of the apparent depreciation. But do you track the exchange rate as well? I know Daily NK has exchange rate data.
Yeah, so we did until about 2022, and then the problem was that, sorry, 1 second, I just need to get my colleague to assist me with plugging this into the charger.
Sure.
Yeah, so we were doing it until about 2022, and then we had to stop because the number of sources in Pyongyang just got so small, it became impossible to get regular updates. Thank you, Ifan. And so there are other outlets doing it, but to be honest, I have big questions about the reliability of the data at this point. We tried working with a North Korean refugee who had connections to connections, and the data was just kind of like didn't make sense. It didn't correspond to open source indicators we were seeing in other areas, so we had to abandon that. But hopefully, if we can talk about this later, it's a big if North Korea reopens again to the point where there are, you know, hundreds of foreigners there again, we'll be able to start collecting that kind of data with confidence.
Yeah, well, Chad, why don't you put up your slide deck, and while you're doing so, I just want to tell the people on the call and those who are watching on YouTube later that this site is really an extraordinary resource. I mean, there are a tremendous number of things up there, including texts of speeches, Rodung Shinmun, aviation tracking, sanctions tracking. I mean, just a variety of sources of information. But why don't I just turn this over to you, Chad, and walk through some of the issues that arise in trying to cover North Korea from a news perspective.
Yeah, sure. So I'm just going to talk about how we know what we know on North Korea, why things have basically been getting worse, a lot worse, and how we are trying to use some of the techniques that Professor Haggard has just mentioned to overcome these problems. So I'll try and do this in about 10 minutes. So how do we know what we know about North Korea? There's essentially 6 main vectors for getting primary source information and secondary source. So external media reports, that'll be your BBC, your CNN, in country, which I'll expand on, but this is some of this websites running from inside the DPRK. Unofficial reports and testimony, so sources stating things, satellite imagery, which has become really important, intel agencies and embassies, sometimes they publicly reveal things. And then, of course, we often see really innovative uses of data by think tanks and academics to demonstrate new trends. So the thing about foreign media is there is a lot of strange stuff out there. So I'm going to give you 3 examples here. BBC News, the Independent newspaper of the UK, and Time magazine. Now, these stories are all pretty far-fetched. And I am going to show you some stories from the tabloid press now. So this is from 2014 Daily Mail, some very rude words about Barack Obama. Daily Star reporting on President Obama, and then Dennis Rodman going to North Korea. Now, if I was to ask you, of all these stories, which is true? Is it the tabloids, or is it the more serious organizations? Well, in these examples I've just shown you, the tabloids are all reporting true stories, and the serious media have all basically got it wrong. The reason is that we basically have a situation with North Korea where lots of unverified material goes into the mix with often very strange, serious, and accurate material. So, for example, we had a story some time ago about Kim Jong-un's girlfriend being shot by firing squad, just based on, quote, sources in China. There she appeared a few years later. She's still alive and active now. In country, we have the official North Korea propaganda coming out of Pyongyang, and there are also a handful of foreign news agencies, but who have very, very restricted access. The problem with the official state media is sometimes in a very George Orwell style movement, they just delete en masse certain content that might not fit the emerging trend. So it's pretty inconsistent and unreliable. In country, those news agencies, like I said, they have big challenges of access, and some people have described what they do as not that far off from the propaganda agencies in Pyongyang.
So
like I
Chad,
said,
is anyone still in Pyongyang outside of AP? I mean, was AP was the first, correct?
AP was the first, but I don't believe they are meaningfully there anymore. There's basically two North Korean state media camera persons who are working remotely for them, but you can just imagine what kind of nightmare that is in terms of doing real journalism. Um, so the other media outlets that are actually using sources from inside the country, New Focus is now finished, but Daily NK, Rinjingang are doing innovative work, but it's very hard to know how reliable this stuff is. And we know that these outlets are paid for by National Endowment for Democracy via Congress, basically. And secondly, they do pay their sources. So that means, which is a big no-no in the world of journalism. It artificially incentivizes people to provide you regular information.
Right.
So
And
lots of
Daily NK, just a word on that. I mean, Daily NK is based in Seoul, correct? And
that's
that's
right.
refugees, and Rimjingang is out of Japan.
That's correct. Yeah. And they're both collecting data, but it's sometimes it feels like since the pandemic, the overall quality has gone down a lot. I think they're going through the same challenges we are. Now, satellite imagery, everyone is probably aware of this now, but 10 years ago, it was not such a common technique. But the interesting thing about it, if you look at this imagery, I'm skipping forward, July, September, January, February. Now, if you look closely, the one consistent thing in all of these images is the angle of the shadow. That's because the satellite is taking the photo at the same time every day, regardless of the season. And that's one of the issues with satellites. Now, back then, there were far fewer satellites in orbit. Now, it's actually a lot higher frequency. But the point I'm trying to make is that North Korea knows it's being watched from above. And I think there is evidence at this point to suggest that they artificially move things around in sensitive locations like nuclear sites to trigger fears, concerns, or put the potential of a North Korea seventh nuclear test back on the agenda. When it comes
I
to
just ask another question about this. I'm sorry to keep interrupting you, but it's just so interesting. So we now have a number of sites that do ongoing analysis of satellite imagery of various sorts. We've got 38 North, there are teams there, and then Beyond Parallel. Is NK News also doing this, or how does it work? How do you get access to the satellite imagery that you want to talk about?
Yeah, we do a lot of satellite imagery analysis. We use a combination of Planet Labs, which is I think some academic institutions might be able to join it. There might be a free plan as well. They offer extremely high frequency, i.e. sometimes several photos a day, but the image quality is low. It's not great, so it's hard to work with. But if you use it in conjunction with the high-res imagery on Google Earth and from some other providers, you can figure out quite interesting changes. We try and avoid overlapping too much with 38 North and CSIS, who both predominantly focus on weapons programs and nuclear activity. So we do a lot more on econ, on agriculture, construction, and try and keep the value proposition more distinct from the
You've done some things on Rason and the North Korea-Russia trade, though, right?
Oh yeah. We've done a lot on the conventional arms trade up in that direction. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll come back to that when we talk about the substance, but go ahead, please.
Yeah. So, like I said, embassies, UN agencies, NGOs, this was the peak level. It's tiny, but there was a large presence at one point of a few thousand people. And if you could get in contact with those people, they provided sort of eyes and ears on the ground, which was really helpful for us to understand things in real time. Now, think tanks, this is quite interesting, but South Korea, the Sunlight Foundation judged South Korea as the #1 East Asian country for buying influence in the US. Now, I say this because if you ever read public policy reports on North Korea or South Korea, 99% chance it's going to be linked in some way to Korean funding. In the US, there are 22 foreign agents. I used to work for one, the Korea Economic Institute. These are organizations and entities that are fully funded, typically by the South Korean government, and are effectively registered with the Department of Justice as people who are advocating for the sort of national position of that country. Yeah, Korea Foundation, like I said, they provide quite a lot of cash to academics, and it's not like there's a direct line of control between what academics and researchers are doing and the funding source, but it's clear that this kind of funding in the political climate we are in here right now in Seoul is certainly not going to be funding initiatives on innovative ways to build trust and peace with the North Korean government. It's quite politically targeted.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is Joshua Stanton, a blogger who once pointed out that, you know, he's described efforts by the Korean embassy in DC to effectively influence the agenda, content, and comment at think tank events. And all of this is relevant because if you're following the news, there was a prominent US researcher, Sumi Terry, who is recently indicted by the FBI for very similar reasons, for not registering under this Foreign Agent Registration Act.
Yeah,
So,
just for the record, that case is quite controversial within the community here. And there's a fair amount of division on whether she was fairly indicted or not. But I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, and it's still not solved. So
Right.
she's innocent until proven guilty. We will be tracking the case, but it's drawn a lot of media attention. So why are things getting worse? Now, going back to all those sort of sensational, crazy stories I showed you at the start, some of which were actually 100% true. The issue is that a lot of the stories coming out of the North Korea ecosystem are very strange, but are actually true. So that gives journalists plausible deniability if, like in the example of BBC that I showed you at the start, where it said everyone's getting Kim Jong-un haircuts. Editors might say, well, North Korea is crazy. Bizarre things do happen, so let's run with the story. And this is Godzilla. Actually, North Korea abducted one of the directors of a South Korean version of Godzilla many years ago because Kim Jong-il wanted to make his own version. So it does show you how strange sometimes the stories are. Of course, the closed nature of the DPRK also contributes to this media ecosystem. Then there's huge pressure on editors when there is some crazy story and it's starting to go viral. Hey, we need to get on this. And so you start getting credible outlets all jumping into the mix. What's been really difficult for us is since the start of the pandemic, North Korea closed its borders and slowly but surely all the foreigners trickled out and we lost a lot of eyes and ears. The other thing is that without diplomacy, North Korea is probably at its most isolated from the West, at least, than it's ever been. We've lost a lot of ability to meet and mingle with North Korean officials on the sidelines of summits, for example, in Singapore and Vietnam. Really interesting development is the border security has got so tight, and defector numbers, another great primary source, are just so far, like we're talking low hundreds now each year.
Right.
I mean, down from 3,000 a year to about 100 or so a year now. Really interesting phenomena inside North Korea. They've become aware that outside researchers like us are watching them and have started taking things into their own hands. You can see here blurring the TV. They blur a lot of stuff now in the background. Even foreigners in Pyongyang have noticed that buildings with high viewing points, they've started obscuring the windows so that people can't even take photos of what's going on the cityscape. That actually used to be another technique of ours. So we are trying to basically use data and all these sources to overcome the problem. And we're trying to take this all impartially and use evidence to support all of our news as much as possible. And yeah, this is the way we're turning that data into like interactive visualizations that everyone can use. And we hope that this in some way helps people get over the challenges. And so, yeah, we have 16 staff, a few dozen contributors, and a lot of clients in the corporate and government sectors. And we are collecting our information from, we think, as reliable primary source, secondary source areas as possible. And I'll leave it there for now. We can come back to this slide later on, maybe.
Yeah, that's good. That's great, Chad. I mean, I think it's really, you know, the service you're providing, and also just as a business venture, I think it's interesting for our students to see that this kind of thing can be done, and, you know, is contributing across a variety of other platforms. I mean, people in business and in government and in the academic world rely heavily on NK Pro and NK News. So why don't we turn to a substantive discussion? And if anyone has questions, if you can put them into the Q&A, the chat's disabled, and we'll try to get to your questions if you have them. But let me start with a story in which the data in question really has to do with speeches that have been given by Kim Jong-un himself, and talk a little bit about the North-South relationship and how you're interpreting that. Obviously, there's been, you know, a quite substantial strategic shift that took place in this January SPA speech with respect to the South, claiming that unification was no longer an objective, that South Korea is going to be treated as a separate hostile country. And now we've had this recent SPA where we expected some constitutional revision to possibly come out of that, and we've heard nothing or very little. Can you just talk to that issue and how you interpret it? Usually in SPA, there's some report which comes out immediately, which at least outlines what had been done. And we haven't seen anything. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, so in January, like you said, Kim Jong-un said he said, I think it's time to abandon reunification. And the thing that a lot of us were watching was he remarked about the fact that there was a need to articulate the southern border in a more clear way.
Exactly.
And he described the so-called northern limit line, the maritime border, as illicit and lawless, and suggested that the SPA would look at constitutionally revising how those borders were interpreted. So everyone was anticipating something big, and I woke up at like 5 a.m. last week on whatever, Tuesday, Wednesday, whenever it dropped, and I pre-wrote my analysis based on the idea that this was happening. And then the Rodong Shinmun state newspaper came out, and it made zero mention of it. And I was like, oh my God, I've just wasted like 2.5 hours, 3 hours writing this thing that's now irrelevant. So I had to try and change flow. And about an hour or two later, something else happened that was like another sort of mix of where this was all going, which was the Korean People's Army General Staff did comment on those issues and stated that they had warned the United States side on the border that they would be taking out physical actions along the border to make real the separation of the two states. But that, interestingly, was not reported in internal North Korean state media, which, for those of you who are new to this, is a really important distinction, because North Korean media will often say one thing to its own people and then use its external facing English language media to say something else to
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't notice that about that particular statement.
Yeah, and the reason I mention it is because some people, and I think this is true, you know, unification had been the decades-long policy of North Korea, 3 leaders, and people in North Korea, when you go there, often talk about it. So to U-turn on that, I mean, it's kind of like if Hamas suddenly woke up one day and said, we're just going to be content with this part of Gaza. We don't want anything to do with rebuilding a broader Palestine. It would be such a big strategic change. And you would wonder then, what would people think about it? And although North Korea is a dictatorship and it has the ability to control the masses, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this has not been going well, or it's very sensitive.
I was going to ask you about that. What would constitute evidence that he might be constrained in saying,
Yeah.
in putting this policy out there?
So the most obvious for me is that in January, he said, we need to get rid of these unsightly examples of reunification. So there's a reunification arch on the highway that tourists used to go to. He ordered it to be destroyed. There's one of the biggest markets is called Reunification Market. There are subway stations. All of those things have been removed now, but there has been zero state media attention drawn to their removal. And this is in contrast to usually when they have those policy shifts, they demonstrate things being blown up or, you know, and so there's been caution on that. Now, when it comes to the SPA, there was a vote, a pre-SPA vote scheduled to take place earlier this year that was severely delayed. And my colleague who does study leadership issues suggested that this was because there was friction at the highest level within the SPA on the potential issue of abandoning unification and reconstituting the border. So, you know, that may be the explanation of why the Supreme People's Assembly took place last week without drawing a conclusion on this. Yeah. I would guess it's still coming, but it's gonna take more time to cook for Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, the fact that there's just been nothing, which is extremely unusual. And then the complexity of having to reconcile this new policy with past policy. And then talking about things like borders, these are obviously going to be highly consequential, because if the borders are really redrawn in a way that is obviously antithetical to what the South Koreans would want to see, you're really talking about new potential sources of territorial disagreement.
Right.
Let me turn to I'm going to cycle through a series of questions because we're so pleased to have you on, and I want to look at different types of information that you use and talk a little bit about the North Korea-Russia economic relationship, because I know you've done things at Rason and looking at things like containers and counting them and getting some sense of what the volume of trade may be in a context where the trade data is now almost completely unreliable, I would assume. Can you just speak a little bit to what we know about what the North Koreans are shipping, and I guess more controversially, what the Russians might be providing in return for that?
Yeah, so just a bit of context. If we go back to 10 years ago, 2014, there was a real growing Russia-DPRK relationship back then. And there was a goal to attain $1 billion of bilateral trade, which a year or two past that goal was sorely not happening. It was like
a fraction of that.
Yeah. And then the relationship just kind of descended and decayed. And I say that because the starting point for this economic relationship, despite all the political clout associated with all the summitry recently, it's really a very minor economic relationship. And from a Russian perspective, North Korean goods, they're not really very desirable, and Russia is able to get much higher quality products by circumventing European sanctions, American sanctions. All the luxury goods are all coming in just fine to Russia, it seems. That being said, Russia is interested in North Korean laborers. That's been a traditional high-ticket area of economic cooperation. They go to places like Vladivostok, the Russian Far East, pretty common to find in the construction sector. And there are unconfirmed reports in the last 48 hours that North Korean military personnel are now being seconded to eastern Ukraine to support with the war effort there, which would be a big step up in terms of highly sanctioned economic activity. But yeah, when it comes to measuring trade, the Russian Customs Service did used to publish data on what was going in and out of the two countries, but I think it was suspended shortly after the Ukraine war began. So that leaves us with observing the shipping port at Rason and counting cargo containers as one possible metric, because a lot of those vessels from the northeastern port of Rason go to Vladivostok. And there is also a train line connecting the northeast of North Korea with Russia, although that is much harder to measure. But what has the big game-changing trend in the last 2 years has been Russian purchasing of North Korean munitions, which is highly sanctioned activity. But the South Korean government stated, I think a month or two ago, that their estimate is that there has been 14,000 containers this year alone of DPRK munitions being transported and sold to Russia. Now, what is Russia providing in return?
Before you turn to that, I just want to underline this because it links back to the discussion you have about nature of data, because those numbers are generated, if my understanding is correct, entirely by satellite imagery of the depots, the rail stations at Rason, right? I mean, it's basically counting containers using satellite data to get some sense of what the volume of the trade is.
Yeah, and the government obviously is in a much better position to do that than open source researchers, because they have the high frequency, high quality imagery that we're less capable of getting. And they're also capable of getting, some governments at least, of having like infrared imagery that can, you know, when it's cloudy, we just don't know what's going on. But they apparently can penetrate through the cloud to see in some cases and measure. So there are definitely limits to the open source capabilities, but yes.
Yeah.
But we don't know what Russia is providing in return. There are a few things that come to mind: fuel, oil, heavy oil, and money, effectively. Those are the three obvious ones. There's also rumor, speculation that WMD, scientific know-how, is one of the capabilities that Russia is providing. There's some evidence to suggest Russian engineers have been supporting in North Korea's latest satellite launch efforts. But one thing that's been really fascinating is that since this military relationship has been blossoming, my colleague Colin has determined through satellite imagery that 10 munitions depots in North Korea in the last 2 years are going through massive renovation, rehabilitation campaigns. So there's clearly money going in to support major modernization of the munitions sector. So I guess that North Korea is being rewarded financially, and it's just adding to the state budget.
Right. And Colin's work, by the way, again, you know, highlighting particular types of data and focused projects is satellite imagery work, right?
Yeah. Yeah, he's the guru of that.
Yeah. Let me turn, you know, since we have your expertise, let me just shift gears to a completely different question. Also, where commentary is thin from the source, what are you seeing and saying about the China DPRK relationship at the moment? It seems to be kind of frosty and silent in terms of both diplomatic exchanges, which is another thing, by the way, which you can track in terms of data, because I think you have a delegation tracker, right?
Yeah. So this relationship has always been talked about as lips and teeth, very close in effect. And this year is the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the two. That anniversary was marked October 6th, just last week on Sunday. And despite that, we're entering what they describe as a year of friendship to commemorate the 75th anniversary. There has been growing speculation that all is not right in the relationship. So to explore that, I thought, well, how can we try and discern through open source databases, indicators, the health of the relationship? So KCNA Watch, shameless plug, which you have access to on your NK Pro membership, is we suck in all the North Korean state media and we make it searchable, and you can even generate charts out of keywords. And so I looked up a few things. Firstly, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, Putin, Bashar al-Assad, all the sort of main despots, they have an interesting habit of writing letters to each other. And so I did some data analysis on number of letters between dictators each year that North Korea was mentioning. And we see that this year, Xi Jinping has seriously dropped. It's like 2 or 3 the whole year. Bashar al-Assad, 14, 15. Putin, 13, 14, something like that. And this year really stands out between Xi and Kim Jong-un. We then used, I think it was ChatGPT to sort of analyze the semantics, the tone of the correspondence that has taken place this year versus previous years. And it sort of drew attention to a lot less wording about the sort of great friendship between the two men. It's much more business-like, very sort of remote. And then we looked at some other indicators like delegations going in and out of North Korea. They have to China. Those have been suspended now for months. I looked then at, I built a CSV file by, this was quite time consuming. I went through all the Chinese Foreign Ministry press discussions about, well, daily ones.
The daily press, daily press meetings, yeah.
Yeah, and I dumped them into a CSV file and then got Claude, which is similar to ChatGPT, to analyze the frequency of mentions of North Korea and the type of language. And again, that also demonstrated a much frostier description of the North Korea problem set from the Chinese side. And I also looked at the way Chinese state media itself was reporting on North Korea, similar trends there. But we also then assembled a bunch of open source indicators, and there's like loads of really fascinating things, like Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un, when they had a summit, I think in 2018, there was a kind of monument that was opened on the area they walked.
Oh yeah.
And that's been removed.
Story in NK News, yeah.
Yeah.
You have these real-time photos of them moving along, you know.
Yeah. And but basically commemorative stuff on the Chinese side of the border to memorialize that has been removed, physically removed. Chinese ambassadors have not been showing up at key ceremonies in North Korea. So there's enough there. We just put all that open source stuff together and said, look, this suggests there's a problem. We don't know what the problem is. We can only speculate. It may be Russia. They're not happy with Russia and the arms trade. I'll just say, like, one Russian colleague, he described it as, can you imagine how Russia would feel if China was suddenly hosting summits in Belarus and, you know, really building a massive political relationship with Belarus? That's right in Russia's Western sphere of influence. Russia would not be happy about that. And that the academic suggested it's the same kind of issue for China.
Right. Well, I mean, again, for those of you who are listening in or watching on YouTube later, you know, the theme, I just want to underline this theme again about these open sources of information which are used for analytic purposes, but essentially derived out of the sorts of news sources that Chad is talking about. And we've mentioned speeches, we've mentioned satellite imagery, and then this delegation data. Can you just say a little bit more about what delegations you're able to capture? I know that, you know, there's this whole question of trade relations between the 3 northeastern provinces and North Korea, and whether they have a vested interest in seeing opening up, speed up.
Yes.
Are you capturing that as well?
So very similar to the leadership tracker that your former student devised, was we used the same kind of logic to build the delegation tracker, because North Korean state media has always been very meticulous in reporting which of its various government ministries and associations go overseas. And so it was a big undertaking, but we just manually went through all the reporting and then built the database by doing that. And there are regular updates from the North Korean side about who's coming into the country and who's leaving. It's probably not everything, of course, but that's how we built it, and that's where we're seeing zero activity for the last
Yeah.
6 months.
Okay, well, look, that just rolls directly into the next question I wanted to ask, and it's one I think Munsa will also have an interest in, is the opening. You know, the whole question of, you know, what's the extent and nature of the opening? How would we get our hands on whether we're where we were? Chinese customs data, which I've taken a look at recently in a short report I wrote on it, is becoming, I think, less and less reliable because there's more and more that's omitted from it, you know, in key areas like coal and oil, obviously, but perhaps in other areas as well. What can we say about the opening based on the types of sources that you guys are looking at?
Well, look, so while we've been developing this website, and there are other websites like Bellingcat that have really made a name for this kind of open source deep dive investigation, use of mirror statistics. The North Koreans, the Chinese, the Russians, they're aware of what's been going on, and slowly but surely the data sources that many of us have been using are drying up. And within the text of the recent Russia DPRK summit that took place in a couple of months ago, 3 months ago or so, there was even a section about penalizing companies and individuals who make public data that can help the enemies better enforce sanctions.
I remember that article very clearly from reading the agreement. I was really struck by that as well. Control the information space. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, it's so crazy. Since that summit, North Korea, its TV channel that we monitor closely, they decided to turn off their satellites they were using a Chinese satellite relay, and they've moved it to a Russian one. And this Russian one is next to impossible to receive here in South Korea. You can get it in Russia. A friend of mine works at a news agency in Russia, and they had some security personnel come to their office in Moscow recently to remove their satellite dish to prevent them getting this material, which is yeah, we're really in new territory, basically, where there is a significant effort by relevant governments to make it much harder. And when it comes to reopening, I think the North Korean state security apparatus is well aware of the fact that there have been foreigners, tourists, aid workers in the past who've been perhaps sharing too much from inside the country. And on balance, from their perspective, what's the value of them working on some kind of irrigation system in remote Rason versus leaking all these like pictures of how dilapidated and underdeveloped the health infrastructure is? Like I'm worried we've passed the golden age, which probably ended 6, 7 years ago, of open source indicators coming out of North Korea, and it's going to really stretch us in future and sort of really force people to become more creative. But you know, there's only so much you can do with satellite imagery and trade data, and we're working in a growing fog basically, and it's easier, I think, to make mistakes without having people that we can speak to in real time on the ground in the capital to say, hey, what's going on?
There's no question about it. And let me just take the opportunity to make note of the disbanding of the 1718 committee.
Oh yeah, we didn't talk about
Munsub
that.
and I were on a panel with the Consul General of LA, and he had actually served on the 1718 committee, and we were talking about that being broken up. But this was formed at the time that the first sanctions resolutions were passed against North Korea. And it's an effort to monitor sanctions enforcement. And now that the Russians have vetoed that, the information the open source information, which was working its way into the 1718 reports. And I think a lot of your research and sources, I think, has appeared in those reports in the past.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's a perfect example of how you have a public international institution that's drawing on the type of open source work that Chad is doing. And now the Russians have basically shut it down and made it more difficult now for the international community to monitor what's going on.
Yeah, and that was a really great two-way relationship, because those UN reports that were on sanctions enforcement also gave us many leads to look into, and were kind of those reports were a dumping ground for mostly Western governments to share intel that they were collecting on North Korea sanctions violations. That then was great for the open source community, and yeah, the UN also benefited from our and colleagues' work and in verse using our material to further their own investigations. And sadly, that's all gone right now.
Yeah. Munson, do you want to comment here? And then we've got two questions, and unfortunately we'll have to start winding up. But thanks, Munson, for coming in.
Okay, so thank you so much, Chad, for joining and sharing deep insight with us. So I will just make one quick question. So I have a question about the use of the recently developed AI, artificial intelligence technologies, on the tracking the North Korean activities. I mean, you mentioned the example of the use of the ChatGPT. I wonder how you guys are currently using and what you guys are planning to do with this.
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
question.
So yeah, I have a lot to say on this, but I'll try and keep it quick. I think this is a game changer, and I think everyone on the call, if you're not already doing it, you need to really invest time in finding out the best way to use these tools. Now, there's GPT and there's another one by Anthropic called Claude, and I've mostly been using Claude. The reason is because it has what's called I think it's a 200K token limit, which is the amount of data and text information it can contain in any given chat. That translates to about 500 pages. It's way higher than ChatGPT. So what you can do—
By that, you mean a prompt, right?
Well, it can be a prompt. It can also be PDFs. You can, so in a single chat, you can upload a lot of materials. And so Claude is also very good at isolating those materials, and you can ask it to just forget the rest of its global knowledge on something and just work, for example, with a UN panel of experts report, which could be 400 or 500 pages long. I've found that my ability to do what I describe as trend analysis, where I take news articles about a certain topic over 2-3 years, like the China and North Korea relationship, the big time thing now is finding all those articles, pasting them into the CSV. There's probably a workaround for that. But when I've got that CSV of a chronology of news articles, I can throw it into Claude, and it helps me create really high quality analysis that used to take me a week to do one article. I can now do it in a day. And I've been using that extremely regularly, aggressively, and it's been a game changer for me. And I would really urge everyone to try and dive into it as much.
And basically why don't you go a little bit more granular detail on how you do this? So you've downloaded a what we call a corpus, a body of work, right? And then you're basically prompting it to produce some summary of the texts.
No, so yeah, firstly make the CSV file with dates, text of full article, and URL. So I have a clear overview of the sources. Sometimes I'll even mark them primary source, secondary source. So let's take China North Korea relations. I'll throw in like maybe 100 articles over the last 2-3 years. Once it's digested that, I'll prompt something like, I'd like to do a trend analysis on China's EPRK relations. Judging from the material here, what are the key issues that come up in your initial analysis of this relationship? And it will start spitting out issues it's seeing or trends it's seeing. You can go further and say, I'm particularly interested in this trend. Can you find examples that support this? you can also ask it to be a kind of thought partner that is more challenging and say, find the holes in my argument. And you know, it's not perfect, but it's really effective at accelerating your ability to do some very high quality analysis. I'd say I'm still a little afraid of using it with data. I find it sometimes counts things a little roughly, but in general, it's great for helping sort of create a draft overview of the types of issues that I need to address within the analysis. And if I've got writer's block, I can actually just write bullet points of what I want to say and ask it, can you help me draft this into copy that I can work with to later publish. So yeah, I think it's making me 30-40% more productive in terms of
well, that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to increase our productivity. Listen, Chad, this has just been a wonderful conversation. I'm so happy we could have you on. I think one of the questions we have from Hyuna Kim has hopefully been answered about sources of information, because we've gone over the variety of those. But we did have one last question, maybe just take a couple of minutes on. On the economic policy reform front, this 20 by 10 and other developments in the agricultural side, do you just have a couple minutes on that and give us a sense of what you think might be going on there?
Yeah, so I'm not being honest, my colleague Colin would be much better prepared to answer this, but as far as I know, it's an effort to invest in modernization and factory rehabilitation in the regions, basically, and across the country. Not North Korean large-scale construction efforts are typically associated with Pyongyang. I think this goal is to try and diversify the locations. The interesting thing is it's being accompanied by a lot of material meetings, diktats from Kim Jong-un about evidence that there's frustration that the economic plan is not yielding massive results, and a lot of complaints that it's down to there just not being enough ideological purity, there being too much corruption, which is still a recurring issue, and orders to just study more about the Juche philosophy and ideological purity and things like that as the sort of solution, but that's not gonna change things. So at the last it was the 6th or 7th Party Congress from 2016. It was a 5-year plan, so that ended 5 years after 2021. And there was Kim Jong-un was very angry with officials about the total lack of
I remember those speeches
on the economic front. And we're now in a new phase of that, and I doubt much is changing because structurally the country is just not set up to incentivize and motivate any game-changing economic activities. And so I think building new factories, upgrading them, it's hard to see how that alone is going to change things. And I'll just point out as well that he's also focused significantly on these huge mega tourist projects in the East Coast, building huge kind of like resort style facilities. Now he wants one up in Samjeon in the Northeast for skiing. These are just frankly far-fetched ideas, and I think it's a really great example of how many yes men there are around Kim Jong-un who don't challenge him and say this is a great idea, and there are no guardrails to prevent these kind of ludicrous plans from coming to reality. And where this scares me is if it's like that within the mega project field, what does that mean about his interpretation of the US and South Korea and their military capabilities? Because one day maybe he's gonna think and be surrounded by people that agree with him that yes, we can actually attack part of South Korea and we can deter US involvement through our long-range nuclear capabilities, and then where are we going to end up? It's definitely worrying.
Well, look, I mean, that's a depressing way to end, but also one which is obviously worrying a lot of us. Chad O'Carroll, thanks so much for joining us. and just particularly underlining for our audience, the range of interesting data that NK Pro and NK News, KCNA Watch, and the other products that you produce bring to the table for us and the way they can be used in creative fashion. Thanks very much for joining us. And for those who are online, we'll see you at the next GPS podcast.